when it comes to building a cannabis economy in South Africa, what are some of the challenges we're going to have to overcome to be able to successfully build the industry and create jobs in the different verticals, all the way from prescription medical cannabis to responsible adult use and industrial hemp? Well, these are some of the questions that was posed by a recent panel by the African Cannabis Advisory Group to 5 panelists from completely different backgrounds. And it was an amazing discussion. It really came to the heart of challenges that we've been experiencing as an industry with government in terms of legislation, with implementation and rollouts and planning. And I really hope that you enjoy this panel as much as I enjoyed moderating it, because we really got into the meat of what's the problem systemic in the South African cannabis industry.
My name is Sibusiso, Xaba, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Africa Cannabis Advisory Group, or ACA Group. We're a services provider that specialized in the medical cannabis and industrial hemp industries. We work with quite a broad range of industry stakeholders, including corporates, governments, entrepreneurs, investors, and we specialize in the conceptualization and execution of cannabis projects. We've got a strong focus on strategy development, investor readiness, capital raising, compliance, and global sales and distribution. Today, I'd like to welcome our guests, our panelists, and everyone joining us from South Africa and around the world for what promises to be quite an action-packed webinar as we look to unpack the future of South Africa's cannabis industry. Now, before going into tonight's webinar, I'd like to just give a special thanks to our sponsors and partners for making tonight possible. Our platinum sponsor tonight is Aeroside Africa, which is a market-leading air purification technology provider that has proven to be effective in helping combat fungal diseases in cannabis, in particular powdery mildew, which for anyone who has grown cannabis, especially at scale, can attest to the pervasive and destructive elements of powdery mildew to a cannabis crop. Aeroside was developed in the US for NASA in terms of applications within their infrastructure, and is also effective in ensuring that clean air is present in processing rooms for cannabis operators. We'd also like to highlight and thank our charity partner for tonight's webinar, which is Friends of Hemp South Africa, which was founded by a good friend and actually one of our panelists today, Ayanda. Friends of Hemp is a broad-based alliance of South African citizens across the private sector, research institutions, government, NGOs, and associations, and is concerned about the prevention and criminalization of industrial hemp in South Africa. The organization has been set up as an NGO and is driven by a desire to unlock the economic and socioeconomic potential of industrial hemp in South Africa. The organization looks to ensure that ordinary South Africans have got a real opportunity to participate in this exciting sector. The NGO is playing a very critical role in bringing to reality a thriving and inclusive cannabis economy in South Africa. We encourage a donation of as little as 100 Rand or more to the charity, and we will be posting details on how you can do that and learn more about their great work in the chat. So let's get straight into it. Tonight we will be unpacking President Cyril Ramaphosa's cannabis sector comments from the State of the Nation address in February 2022. Cyril Ramaphosa laid out his ambitious vision of utilizing cannabis for significant economic development and job creation, facilitated by positioning South Africa to be a global leader in the cannabis industry. Now, the president's comments have been met with both hope and skepticism. Tonight, we bring together some of South Africa's leading cannabis entrepreneurs and stakeholders to outline how, if at all possible, South Africa can achieve this feat in the face of stiff global competition and limited fiscal resources. It's difficult to believe how cannabis has transitioned from a controversial underworld industry that governments around the globe have spent billions of dollars to try and eliminate, to today being a global concern transforming the health and wellness of millions of individuals across the globe. Not only that, But the industrial potential of cannabis to combat climate change and to create sustainable materials for use across a broad range of industries, including textiles, plastics, building materials, biocomposites, paper, is only just getting started. To really get a glimpse of the potential of the cannabis industry to spur economic growth, create jobs, and improve our health and wellness, two of the world's most advanced economies need to come into focus in terms of cannabis, which is the US and Canada. Now, in the US, despite the fact that cannabis is still federally illegal, the cannabis industry in the US has created north of 400,000 jobs to date in just a short period of years, a couple of years. Studies have shown that the use of dangerous and addictive opiates in states where cannabis is legalized in the US is on a downward trend, as more patients suffering from chronic pain move towards cannabis. Now, remember that the opioid crisis in the US is responsible for the death of between 30 and 70,000 people every single year. To date, not a single recorded death has been recorded from cannabis overuse. Canada is also another shining example in terms of the potential of this industry. The cannabis economy in Canada has created over 150,000 jobs and over $20 billion in economic value over the last few years in a fully legal framework. It's no wonder that South Africa is betting on cannabis to resuscitate its struggling economy. With an unemployment rate of 35% and growing, South Africa needs to urgently create the right environment for the cannabis economy to thrive, whilst ensuring that the poorest in our country have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in this new legal industry. So my view is 130,000 jobs over, let's say, a span of 10 to 15 years is not impossible, but it is a real challenge in order for us to bring this into reality. It would require a collaborative effort across different key stakeholders, including government, investors, the private sectors, and communities to bring this to light. The development of a thriving local cannabis economy will also have to delicately balance global best practice. In other words, all the lessons that we learn internationally from advanced economies, with a granular understanding and appreciation of South Africa's unique socio-economic environment. South Africa would also need to develop unique operating and regulatory models that can allow for the integration of traditional growing communities into the legal cannabis framework. South Africa is estimated to have over 900,000 traditional cannabis growers, so this is an extremely important consideration for the country's cannabis future. Research and development would also have to be central to the country's efforts to build this new economy. Not only is work required to map and identify landrace strains unique to South Africa, IP that we can develop and export to the rest of the world, but well-designed clinical trials would also need to be launched in order for us to better understand how to utilize cannabis to improve the health and wellness of our citizens. Further research will also be required to unlock the potential of industrial hemp. As a fairly new legal sort of material, work needs to be done to develop a local hemp supply chain and drive the cost of production down to enable hemp to be an economically viable substitute for traditional, more carbon-intensive materials. The job creation potential in hemp is significant, as labor is required on large-scale farms, often hundreds, if not thousands of hectares big, and more skilled labor will also be required to process and manufacture hundreds of new product lines across hemp. The adult use of the recreational applications and vertical within industry also cannot be forgotten, as this is the basis from which today's current activities in the cannabis industry actually happen. And a lot of work would need to be done to create the appropriate frameworks there. I'm excited to unpack this topic further with the great esteemed panelists, as well as my friend and colleague, Jeff Verlinden, who will be leading and moderating today's discussion. Just some quick background on Jeff. So Jeff is a sales executive at Separations, a company that has been in the South African laboratory and pharmaceutical equipment supply and support space for the last 3 decades. Jeff is a biochemist and joined Separations in 2010, working in their pharmaceutical support division, and has worked with most of South Africa's pharmaceutical companies. Jeff has a passion for cannabis extraction and formulation workflows, along with all the necessary testing analytics to ensure the highest quality products reach consumers. Jeff, over to you to introduce the panel discussion. I'm really excited for today's session.
Hi, Sibs. Thanks for having us all on to discuss it. Can I ask all the panelists to open up their visuals so we can see them all for the audience? So I'm excited because what we have today is a good mix. We've got licensed cultivators. We've got someone who's really specialized in international trade, so can really speak to the progress of medical cannabis. We've got lobbyists really actively involved in pushing reform within government. We've got someone who's also active across the continent in terms of lobbying reform, and we've got a lawyer. So at the end of the day, if you're going to be in the cannabis space, you need a lawyer there, and we've got Sibs to give us some advice on financial fundraising and investment banking. So what I'd like to do to get us kicked off is I'd like to have the panelists self-introduce, so to give us a quick synopsis on their role and their function within the cannabis space and community. And I'd like to order it in the following. I'd like Leslie to start us off, then I'd like to go to Tseli, I'd like to go to Ayanda, Danmari, and then let's get started in terms of a quick introduction, and then we're going to jump straight into questions.
Thanks, Sibs, and thanks, Jeff, for having me on the panel. I'm really honored. Just a bit of background about us. I'm the CEO of Felbridge. We're a licensed cultivation facility based in the Stellenbosch area of the Cape. We come from a strong agricultural background. We're fourth generation farmers. We've been farming for over 100 years, supplying predominantly the local market with fruit. We got into cannabis in 2019. We were given the go-ahead by SAPRA, and we're licensed for 14,000 square meters of cultivation area, which is predominantly in greenhouse or all in high-tech greenhouses. And to date, we have shipped over a ton of flower to Switzerland, and about 20 shipments of cannabis tissue culture to various countries in Europe, Spain, Switzerland, North Macedonia, Israel, Canada, Lesotho. Yeah, and we've got some exciting things coming up hopefully soon.
Awesome, excellent. Let's hand over to Tseli for a quick introduction.
Thank you, Jeff. My name is Tseli Khiba, and I'm a practicing lawyer based in Lesotho. I am the founder of 1A Solutions, a cannabis consulting company, as well as a member on the African Union's Expert Committee on Cannabis, which basically seeks to assist member states in developing their cannabis legislation and reform. Thank you.
Awesome, excellent. Let's go to Ayanda.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Ayanda. I'm a cannabis entrepreneur. I've been working in the cannabis industry for almost 10 years across 4 different continents, both as an operator, but also as a lobbyist and an advisor to government and private sector, particularly around reforms. I'm one of the founders of Friends of Hemp South Africa, which SIPS provided a little bit of an introduction around, but we're one of the national associations representing hemp. I serve as the private sector representative on the National Cannabis Master Plan Committee and work with a number of these fine panelists on here as well. But mostly the work that we advocate for is really around the liberalization of industrial hemp. I also serve on the board of the Federation of Industrial Hemp Organizations, which is the largest hemp federation on the planet, representing 70 countries across all continents. Thank you.
Awesome. Danmari.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Danmari Duguid. I'm an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa, and I'm the cannabis lead for Schindlers Attorneys. We're the first law firm in South Africa with a medical and recreational cannabis department. I practice in general and commercial litigation, commercial drafting, dispute resolution, intellectual property, blockchain, and cannabis law. Thank you so much.
Awesome, excellent. So naturally, I'm inclined to want to go straight for the jugular and ask the question about 130,000 jobs and how to get there. But before we do that, I think it's important to get a bit more context on each of the panelists. So let me start off with Ayanda with a question. And this is not the easiest of questions. So Can I ask you, Ayanda, in your view, what has government done right so far with regards to cannabis reform? I mean, there are certain aspects we could probably praise them for, but also, you know, what is really critical to get right if we're going to enable and unlock the economy and access as a greater scheme?
Thanks for the question, Jeff. I mean, where does one actually begin to answer this? I think on the whole, the stance towards cannabis has broadly been positive over the last couple of years. The how you actually sort of operationalize that sort of ambition is really where the challenge has been. And so over the last couple of years, I think we've had a sector that's been characterized by a lack of coordination and a very high degree of fragmentation within government. So that has made it very difficult to get something of a coherent kind of regulatory framework, which means at the moment you sort of got different pieces or different segments of the cannabis industry sort of moving in different ways. I think in some ways, SAPRA, and as much as sort of they end up being the guys on the receiving end of a lot of frustration, I think in some areas of sort of advanced cannabis, probably more than any of the other departments or agencies, in allowing for medicinal cannabis, even with its restrictions. But I think they're much further ahead, including also liberalizing, obviously, hemp and allowing for an exemption, which while it doesn't make sense, is still at least some step towards the right direction. I think the biggest win so far, at least from our perspective, is the liberalization of industrial hemp, which I think was a major milestone, given that lots of folks had been waiting for about 22 years for any kind of commercialization opportunity to arise. So that has been a really great area. There's some, the announcement by the Department of Justice around the commercialization of recreational cannabis, I think that's absolutely game changing. The vehicle through which they're trying to do it, the private purposes bill, is not the right one to do it in, for all sorts of reasons, including sort of constitutionality issues. But I think our panelists from Schindlers can sort of touch on some of those. Where I think they're really, in our mind, what really is needed to do is to try and consolidate and get a little bit more singularity around sort of the cannabis regulatory environment. Let's go actually for one major bill that allows you to solve a number of issues and cover the breadth. I think we're talking about 11 or 12 different pieces of legislation. That's sort of where we need to really go. The unlocking, especially with the Drugs Act, I think is sort of a major challenge across the board, whether that's, you know, whether or not licenses or permits, even for hemp, are legal, or preventing the flow of funds and traditional finance from being able to invest. These are some of the areas where we need quite a bit of work still. And I think a lot of it is around, we have sort of a big ambition, but let's also remember that this is a very nascent industry, and we need to sort of build up some kind of foundational building blocks before we can actually sort of think about these grander ambitions. So I'm very excited to get into the discussion about the achievability of the 130K target.
Awesome, excellent. No, I would agree with your comment there. I would say SAPRA has probably run with it since 2018, probably the most aggressively from government standpoint. I mean, there's even the Directorate of Food Control that could be involved from, you know, food stuff, disinfectant, cosmetics. You know, they regulate those industries, but they've been silent on the matter of, you know, consumer goods. And let's be honest, agriculture eventually found it. October, you know, getting commercialization going. But there's still some points which we're going to talk about today in terms of how to really enable the full value chain. Because hemp just cultivated by itself, it serves little value. We're not looking at tertiary processing. So fantastic. I'm excited for what we're going to unpack and discuss. But let me throw it to TD, because you're quite involved in terms of different regulatory areas across, you've been to quite a few events in Europe as well. How do you see it from, let's just call national governments, or also the politicians in different African countries? What is their perception in terms of their view on cannabis? We've seen a few countries make some progressive moves. Malawi, we've seen Zimbabwe pushing. Lesotho was the first to move as well on the continent. There's Zambia talking. There's Madagascar that's very conservative. You know, there's all these different ideas. Tell us how you see it across the African continent and landscape.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Generally, I think there's a lot of conservatism in how a lot of governments and politicians have approached the cannabis topic. And again, the conversations we have outside the conferences, off the formal stage also quite different to what we see happening. I think generally from an African point of view, most people have a story or have some understanding of the cannabis plant, apart from the propaganda that has been channeled and spread over a very long time. So I think it's also an issue for leaders and policymakers to really conceptualize how to shift from the prior war against drugs approach to a more progressive approach. But I am encouraged by the fact that I think there are more discussions of this nature taking place. And what I have found is that the whole issue about the cannabis industry ties in quite well with a lot of the issues that member states are really seized with. They're really looking into sustainable approaches to agriculture and ways to modernize it. They're looking at ways to create jobs. They're looking at how to improve access to medicines. So within each of those projects and topics that are already ongoing, I think it's quite easy to throw in the cannabis element and bring that to the table for discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always been a big proponent of African botanicals. I do believe this will be one of our major exports for South Africa, for the rest of Africa. Going a decade forward, African botanicals, where cannabis is a vital component of that, is going to shape, it's what is going to be a massive sector for the industry across the spectrum, from Scaletium, cannabis, and the rest. And I'm glad to see Africa seizing the opportunity. I would like to see a stronger focus on local economy, local access, local initiatives. This idea of just getting on board now to be if you were the 8th country in Africa to now export, that's not relevant. You know, there's this lack of relevancy because it's challenging. We've seen Colombia come on board as well. So it's about how do we improvise and move this industry forward. So talking about action on the ground, let's go to Leslie, because Leslie, you've been someone who's seized the opportunity from the medical standpoint. You've implemented, a real strong focus on genetic cultivation. You've been highly successful with, it's nearly almost a dozen, I think, territories you've exported to, and some of them quite challenging to get into. So talk to us about the feasibility of building Felbridge, the implementation, a bit of the challenges, and how you made it work to your advantage.
Yeah, so we approached it like farmers, and we kind of went for the low-hanging fruit first. I think we basically said to ourselves, well, if we're going to get into cannabis, let's just get this business scaled. You know, we see cannabis in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years being another crop. Again, becoming highly commoditized with all this production that's coming on stream globally, with Colombia coming on stream, Spain in a few years. There's massive amounts of production, even in other African states. So our focus has been very much to scale up our business, to get it to the ability to produce high quality medical grade cannabis and at a low cost. And build our markets from there. And that's pretty much what we've done. We've supplied into markets where the regulations are not EU GMP, for example. They're more GACP, such as Switzerland. And that's let us scale up the business. And I can't stress how difficult it is to scale up a cannabis business. We've made tons of mistakes, and we're still making mistakes, but I'm hoping that as we get into a level where we can get into more regulated markets, we've got the scale and the capacity to just plug into those countries. So it's been a really, really difficult few years. And I think the thing that's sitting at the back of our minds, and I'm sure sitting at the back of everyone's minds on this panel, is where the regulation's going to go, and how to enable the regulations to make it easier for us not only to grow the product but to access markets internationally. And I think this is also where SAPRA comes in getting its getting licensed growers here recognized to be able to supply into developed markets like Germany and Israel and wherever the new markets will be opening up. So a lot of challenges, but like we see the opportunities here, and we've approached this as what can we do quickly and get into markets, because in 2, 3, 5 years time, those markets are going to be saturated and they're going to work with the guys that they know, and we need to be there.
Yeah, fully. No, I agree on that point of scalability. I mean, we've seen this across the US specifically, like the inability to market and advertise a business. I mean, we're looking to create 100,000 jobs or more. We need to have businesses have traditional banking access. I mean, this is still highly restricted in the US. Making a business relying completely on cash is not good for the IRS. It's not good for sustainability. It's not good for security on those sites. I mean, there's a couple challenges, and I mean, a lot of this stems from things like the United Nations, which I know TD can talk to, in terms of, you know, a lot of the African countries look to policy. I mean, we've seen this with the Ukrainian conflict, you know, the ability of a central, you know, regulatory environment where it's almost adopted would help the rest of Africa develop. But I'm really interested in that aspect of marketing, how to drive it, how to develop it. I'll use an example for South Africa. I mean, a lot of medical patients are now getting access through Section 21, but you're not even allowed to advertise an unregistered medicine. So how do these companies actually go about talking about their products when it's not a registered marketing authorized medicine? There's a bunch to say there. And I want to throw this maybe to the legal side, which is Danmari. Maybe give us a bit of context on Schindlers' involvement in the cannabis space, and what are some of the main activities that Schindlers is focused on right now in terms of driving reform, improving access, and getting policy to work for us?
Thanks for that. So just to give everybody some context, so Schindlers is, as I've mentioned, South Africa's first firm with a medical and recreational department. But this already started back in 2017 when we started representing the Dagga couple, which is an influential couple in South Africa for the cannabis space. And our firm applied to intervene in the Prince matter in 2017 in what came from the Western Cape High Court, which needed to move to the Constitutional Court. We applied to intervene there and we succeeded. And after months of preparation and getting some of the world's best top class experts on board, we were successful with our application to decriminalize cannabis for private consumption by adults in September 2018. Now, Schindlers essentially focuses on 5 primary areas when it relates to cannabis advice. These include your corporate and intellectual property law, medical cannabis licensing and compliance. We've got our recreational cannabis law, and we also have been on litigation, which involves maybe reviewing decisions by state functions, for example, or even doing stays of prosecution for people who might still be carrying cannabis-related arrests. Now, post the judgment, our engagement hasn't stopped. It hasn't been limited to clients only. So what we've also done as a firm is that we've made submissions, both written as well as orally to Parliament in relation to the new private purposes bill. Now, what I would like to highlight here is just that it is a bill, it's not yet law, and that is to our benefit as we're still in the process of public participation. And that's what we took advantage of as a firm. So we wrote a public letter to Parliament, we've made submissions to Parliament in relation to the bill, and just with the legalities and constitutionality of certain aspects of the bill. So as Sam has already mentioned, there is concerns in relation here too, but more specifically, we are pushing from the start to have industry and regulation, which is going to both stimulate both local and international investments. There is a big conversation at the moment, especially within South Africa, with questions being raised. How is local entrepreneurs supposed to compete with international investment, and how are they supposed to access the market? And then, of course, we also have on the other side the legal red tape, as we've just started to touch on as well. So there is a lot, there's a lot to discuss from the legal side, but as we've also mentioned and pointed out, we've made a lot of progress. I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it was only in September 2018 that it was decriminalized. And as we've mentioned, other departments have taken up more than others. We do have certain legal challenges. As mentioned, the Drugs Act still defines cannabis as an illegal substance, and it still defines that as the plant and the whole plant or any portion of the plant. So that makes it quite confined. So Schindlers' role has both been to be a voice for our clients, to be for the industry itself, to continue to help to develop the industry where possible, but also to take care of our clients' private interests. And what I mean by that is that, courts are available to everyone. Although attorneys, we live, we breathe these things every day, it doesn't mean it's exclusively for us. We represent quite a few NGOs and lobby groups that also then come to us and challenges these decisions by Parliament, challenges these regulations moving forward so that we can continuously shape this as it's coming along. So we're hoping that that does make a difference as we go, and we've seen it as well. It really is, the conversations are being taken up, we are being taken seriously. Just as by way of example, the first engagement on the private purposes bill was very primary. It was very like high level, and it was actually still clouded with some confusion. We have to compliment Parliament on the second session of public participation in terms of the bill. It was a lot more scientific based. They started asking questions such as, will this be attacked in court? Will this hold up in a review application? And this is the questions that we want to be seeing Parliament being asked, because this is the questions that we've posed to Parliament. Please ensure that these regulations, that these laws will not be attacked, that they do not need to go through a court process. Because as we've pointed out, the more that we are slowed down, the longer it takes for us to reach the international market and to reach our potential to get to those 130,000 jobs. I mean, in the last year, the US has been able to create over 100,000 jobs in the US alone. And I mean, that's quite something if you compare that to your financial sector, which created 140,000 formal jobs. So it really is starting to compete with other industries. But as we've mentioned, it's about getting into the market, getting our regulations right so that we can really stimulate that investment and stimulate the interest that we've been receiving so far.
No, awesome, 100%. I mean, and I think this also relates to a point of lobbying, and I think we can come back to this topic about lobbying, because I looked at the comments on the private purposes bill when it was reviewed in Parliament, and I was actually a bit stumped and shocked to actually see only 32 organizations and individuals that actually commented to Parliament. And I know who was on that list because I reviewed it closely and I looked at the comments, and for me, it was like, there needs to be this push from, you know, being an activist, being a lobbyist. Like, it's really important that people comment on that bill. I mean, I did it as a private individual, organizations did it. Like, if you want to be in this industry, you as a citizen in this country have the right to email Parliament and put forward your views on the private purposes bill. And it's very disappointing to see that since September 2020, when this was supposed to be ratified or implemented in some form, we're still waiting, and it's coming to almost 4 years. And you know, I mean, I think it's really important that citizenry also understands that whatever shape the bill might have taken initially, and maybe in its impotence or when it was initially drafted, yes, there was a lot of challenges. But remember, you having a ratified bill gives you a right. So for instance, if there was an agreement on how much you could carry as an individual when traveling, that's a right. And to avoid the ambiguity of the law is really important. I mean, that's what we need to do, is ratify certain measures, but I agree with you. We need to be comprehensive, inclusive, and we're going to talk about it, because the longer we delay, the harder it is to formalize, standardize, and create jobs. And to that point, Sibs, I want to bring you in here and maybe highlight here for you, you know, what has been encouraging, because you've been involved and looking at different investment options, you know, whenever someone's putting capital into a business, there's definitely the due diligence that needs to go into it. There's the regulatory considerations that need to be addressed. It's not been easy because there's a lot of restrictions, there's a lot of ambiguity, there's definitely gray pockets everywhere you look. What have you seen that's encouraging that maybe brings you to this sense that, you know what, in the next couple of years, we can create a very sustainable economic development for cannabis and low THC hemp? How does that look going forward for you? What's encouraging from what you've seen? Oh, Sibs, you just on mute there.
Sorry, so I think to answer that question, we have to look at firstly the medical cannabis opportunity, which is going to be a much smaller opportunity. I think people need to be aware of that, because it is a lot more technical. It requires a lot of capital. As you mentioned, SAPRA has had a lot of pushback because of the fact that you have to develop a facility first before it gets audited and you get your license. And, you know, you're talking in the range of, at the very, very sort of minimum in terms of a functional facility that can export internationally, probably around that 20 million rand mark, even though you can build facilities for cheaper, but at the moment it will be quite difficult to sort of enter export markets. and a lot higher on the top end, 100 million plus. But we are starting to see some local players now beginning to integrate into the international supply chain. Felbridge is one of them, and they've been playing a pivotal role in terms of flying the South African flag high in international markets, showing that we can develop world-class products that can be supplied into international markets. But we're also seeing other cultivators that are specialized in selling bulk flower beginning to move product into Australia, into Israel, into Europe, and so forth. And it's a slow start. I think the one thing about, especially on the medical cannabis side, is that it always takes 2 or 3 or 4 times longer than you anticipate, because of the need to scale, because of the need to calibrate your sort of cultivation, quality control, etc. But I think we are starting to see the emergence of some local players that we think will be, that have the potential to be global champions. Our view is that there has to be an overlay of R&D, particularly on unique strain development, partnerships in terms of sort of mapping strains to different applications and so forth. So as mentioned across the webinar, simply going for a commodity play, I think is a little bit more of a shorter term. You'll see decent margins on the short term, but there'll be margin compression because of how much product is coming into the market. But I think what has been encouraging and frustrating at the same time has been the movements on the hemp side, because I think we know that the potential that hemp holds in terms of the end products it can produce. Hemp has got 4 times, an average higher CO2 absorption factor than most plants. It's got, so in other words, integrating hemp into a supply chain to produce products, biodegradable plastics, textiles, biocomposites for cars, etc., can significantly reduce the carbon footprint of industries that we see today. So we've taken some steps in terms of the permits and so forth, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done for that to actually begin to sort of gain steam and momentum. So we're watching developments there quite closely. We do realize that there's a lot of execution risk in terms of developing a large-scale hemp supply chain, in terms of cultivation best practice, mapping of different strains and cultivars to different parts of the country, the processing equipment and so forth, and the manufacturing equipment. It's a long journey, but we are encouraged by the fact that we're taking the first tentative steps.
Okay, awesome, excellent. Well, now we've heard from each of the panelists on a bit of a, their view on the industry. I want to get into now the brass tacks, like how do we get to 130,000 jobs, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to pose this to each of the panelists, but I'm gonna put some prefaces here. I want to know the distribution. How do you see it? And what are some of the stumbling blocks related to it? So specifically, we've talked about medical, we talked about industrial hemp, we talked about responsible adult use or recreational. I mean, I often like to say pharmaceutical cannabis instead of medical, because I do believe medical cannabis as a whole has medical benefits. So I think the term medical cannabis is somewhat, it's skewed. Even in the US, it's not seen as a marketing authorized product like an Epidiolex. So when we talk about medicinal cannabis, we really are looking at that prescription type. It will always, in my view, form maybe 5% of the market. Realistically, if we look at how industries have matured in North America specifically and Canada, I think we need to start talking about, we're going to get inclusion, because the medical industry is not inclusive. I know, because I come from the pharmaceutical world. As much as I like to talk about the industry, break it down, make it more accessible to the public so they understand how medicines get registered, how it gets to the public, it's always going to be that 5%. It's never going to be where you're going to see the scale. And yes, the science in that region is so important to drive the benefits. I mean, I think the 2018 FDA approval for cannabinoid therapeutic really gave the UN and others that opportunity to start backing it. And it's always nice to have a scientific rationale for implementing changes that might affect social reform, might affect certain policies, might go against the current. But I think a lot of countries have gone against the current with drug policy. So let's talk now, how do you as an audience see it in terms of how do we get there? And what does the distribution look like between adult use in terms of potential dispensaries that could be implemented, how that might look, and also the industrial side. Like, I know Ayanda is probably going to have a lot to unpack on the industrial side, and I know that Tseli will maybe talk about policy. I know that Danmari will have a lot of legal cons, and I think Leslie can speak to the broad range of it, because we've had some previous discussions that have been very high level. And Sibs, I know you track global markets like I do. So let's maybe cycle back around in the same order. Let's go back to Ayanda. Let's unpack 130,000 jobs. Give us maybe an estimation as well, everyone, on timelines. Like, could we do this in 2 years? Could it be achievable to drive that kind of growth in 2 years? It would require massive reforms. It would require a lot of adoption. But like, is 5 years more realistic? Give me a timeline and give me a distribution if you can.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Look, my perspective is I suppose is informed by having to like do industrial development in many different new categories, including in South Africa, in like the niche textiles fiber space. I think almost the question is not really so much about, you know, the 130,000, does it work, but actually what do you need to do in order to be able to get there? Now, for me, I think the first thing is really the timelines. This is not achievable, not even in 5 years, maybe in 10, okay? And that's simply because in order for you to be able to build up this kind of like job-rich industry, there's a lot that you need to do in terms of building up certain kinds of capabilities, plugging in various holes. You know, let's take, for example, the fact that if you get a permit from Dalrad, you're gonna have to get a permit for every 50 hectares, right, that you're going to be growing. Now, how quickly do you scale that up, like from 50 to a couple of thousand? When you think that, and I hear the comparisons with the United States and with Canada, it's not pound for pound here, because you're also, cannabis doesn't exist as an industry that's a vacuum, right? So you can say, well, if you know, you can move that way and that country has done this, but it's because you have an enabling environment where other sectors, for example, already benefit, right, from there. We already have basic constraints in general, for example, in the agricultural industry, that are also going to be the same kinds of challenges you have for hemp and cannabis. So I think there needs to be some kind of realism. I mean, let's give you an example of citrus. I mean, one of our big export crops, right? It's one of the biggest revenue earners. And I think we're like the second largest exporter of citrus. And that entire industry, I think has been in existence for about 7 decades, exporting for the last 4. And they have about a total of 120 or 130,000 jobs. So there needs to be like a real reality check about how you actually build up the blocks to be able to get there, starting off with sort of the low hanging fruit, the stuff where you can actually anchor capabilities that exist in other industries where you might already have a competitive advantage. You need to build up, but for us, it's like, it's lots of gaps, right? And I wish almost that we'd taken an approach of saying, okay, not just like 130,000 jobs sort of plucked out of nowhere, but actually where are we landing, right? That justifies like the 130,000 jobs in like 10 years. Because at the moment, I don't think we even have sort of the coherence around that, because we can't assume that we're going to be competitive in cannabis in every single segment. It's not going to happen. And I think at the moment, sometimes the conversations happen and it's like, well, no, we go for everything and then somehow we'll be the best at it. And it really doesn't happen that way. It's so refreshing to be able to hear from Leslie talk about like the learning curve. It's really huge. We don't have a lot of areas. I mean, I get, you know, lots of engagements from provinces where you've got growing of hemp and folks are sitting on hundreds of tons of biomass that actually can't be processed, well, because there isn't that capability there. And even worst of all is that I hear a lot of folks talking about how actually the market is already there. Well, coming from the industrial hemp side, I mean, I'd like to know where exactly you think that market is, because I would love to be able to send my members there. But the truth of the matter is this is an area where we actually might get government to usefully actually compact different partners to be able to create markets, you know? So a simple example would be that if, let's say, the government decided, like the Chinese government, maybe not the best example for everything, but in this particular sector, just simply mandating that the uniforms that are used by army personnel are going to be made from hemp. Boom, that's a market. Private sector responds by saying, well, we need to actually create all the various bits and pieces in the chain that allows us to be able to actually meet that. So sort of start from the demand first and then work your way backwards. because I don't think that 130,000 is something that's achievable in 5, 7. I think if we're looking 10, 15 years, and provided we can get very basic things done around market development, making sure we can set up standards. For example, there are folks in medicinal cannabis right now who have everything, all the capital in the world, and still aren't able to like get a consistent certificates of analysis, or struggling to get export permits, right? So they can send stuff to market. These are the big stumbling blocks, by the way, when you're thinking about building things up from scratch. So what do we do sort of in those areas? And the big unlock for us is get the friggin' regulations sorted out, and don't wait for like another year. We can't afford to wait for another season to go past, and we haven't been able to do very much about this area. So let's think about the regulations first, but then very quickly, let's think about the market and then work our way backwards on what are all of the various things that we require, and be also very targeted around where is the competitive advantage for South Africa in various product categories. It's not going to be everything. So I'm a little bit of a, not so much of a skeptic, but really a realist around what is actually achievable and some of the various things that are required to enable that.
Awesome. No, I enjoy that. I like that example of China as well. I mean, textiles is probably the most complex side of industrial hemp in terms of getting it right, because you really, you know, yeah, there's a lot you can compare with cotton, and yes, it's superior to many degrees, but to get a fabric that doesn't irritate the skin is no easy task. I mean, ask anyone in the US that's in agro-processing of hemp. That industry is actually still in its infancy when it comes to industrial use, less so the extraction. And that's really important, because people just see this farm bill from 2018 in the US and like, it's all going to be amazing. And I would say to that point on mandates, I mean, it would be fantastic to see something like from government, maybe on RDP housing and sustainable plastic substitutes, you know, like get practical. Like if we're going to allow for hemp processing, where's the agro processing? I mean, I've heard of one decommissioned facility in Winterton. Like we need to then enable, government needs to push for agro processing so that there's a reason that these collective farmers can co-op into an area for processing. And what are we going to process? We're not going to make t-shirts. That's just not practical. That industry is 5 years plus off. You know, it would take quite a lot to go. Yeah. And I mean, I know Leslie mentioned as well earlier, you know, it's one where there's so much. I mean, there was a discussion about registered crops. I mean, let's get cannabis registered before we can even talk about IP, because that's a part of what Schindlers does. But we need IP protection if we're going to now improve genetics, focus on, you know, what are we cultivating hemp for? So I love that idea. I love that comparison, because it really is, it's something that simple about getting, you know, industry involvement, government involvement, and we need to move. We've lost too many seasons. So let's kick this agenda. So let's move around now to TD. TD, where do you see it in terms of distribution? I'm getting a feeling, and I'll probably also agree with it, that 130,000 jobs is steep. The one contrast I would say is, let's ask the question as well, maybe we'll factor this in. How many people currently employed informally in the illicit side of cannabis? Because if you work it out, there's about 38 million adults in South Africa. And if you look at consumption rates of cannabis, it gives you a leaning to like, hey, maybe there's a lot of people out there. I think also the definition of a job or a sustainable employment is a big point, because Africa won't have the level of automation that the US and China and other areas have. So maybe more jobs per hectare is realistic. But again, it's not the type of jobs I think a lot of people want to see. It's a start, but we need to drive to higher end jobs like we see in Canada and the US market. So TD, to you, talk us through how you see the split and how you see the distribution and numbers.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. My view is I also agree with Ayanda regarding the timeline. Just based on previous experience and looking at where we are, and by that I mean broadly South Africa and Lesotho. And just from my experience in Lesotho from 2017, it is still quite a big challenge to get accurate data regarding how many jobs have been created since the cannabis licenses have been issued, and to be able to determine to what extent has the cannabis industry impacted positively on Lesotho's economic performance. So I think there are still challenges around data collection and getting information which would enable us to make such predictions on how much would recreational or adult use cannabis contribute in terms of job creation, in terms of economic impact, and so on. So it's always a bit tricky to give a firm answer. But that said, I do believe that there is definitely big scope to aid job creation through the cannabis industry. And specifically what I've seen is, again, with reference to my Lesotho experience, is that there've been a lot of strategic alliances or allegiances that have been formed, which I think have really benefited parties on both sides, from Lesotho companies collaborating with South African companies, but also during the 2017-2018 years, there was a lot of participation from Canadian-based companies and Israel-based companies, which I think also contributed immensely to the development of Lesotho's cannabis industry, both in terms of know-how, access to the global markets, as well as compliance support with standards and requirements, and also to the extent that it was possible for them to also engage and to reach out to regulators and policymakers, because I think because they're coming from more mature markets, their insight will be different to what you would maybe normally come across in a report. And again, I think there's definitely much to be said about one-on-one engagement versus really trying to push policymakers to, read certain recommended texts, which I think we're all familiar with. So for those reasons, I do think it will contribute largely to employment. However, it is quite hard to give a better estimate. And relating to what you said as well regarding the pharmaceutical industry, I do agree that it's a very expensive area in terms of the cannabis industry, which most people will not have access to or be able to participate in, simply for the high costs, the high standards that need to be met, the consistency that's required. However, I still do encourage many to go through that line, because we do have a huge problem on the continent in terms of the development of local medicines, traditional medicines, and also access to affordable, effective medicines as well. And just, looking at the COVID pandemic, cannabis has been shown to assist with the inflammation and other symptoms. So I think there is scope to delve into the medical aspect and to expand on that. I also support developments in hemp, and just from discussions I've had broadly with policymakers on the continent, is I think one of the critical issues that I've come across is that whole issue about the percentage of THC. I think the other problem is really getting people to move away from that, because that creates a lot of complications on how will it be extracted, what kind of seeds are we going to need. Globally, we've seen in the EU and the US, it's a huge problem. So it's a question of, okay, do African members set a different percentage from the get-go that can be applied across the board, or is a more flexible approach required? And again, hemp has so many spin-off industries that I think that speaks for itself in terms of what that will do for job creation. And adult use, that is usually the more controversial one, and that takes us back to the UN treaties and so on. And that probably needs a whole different discussion altogether, but I do believe that the UN treaties do have sufficient scope for countries to be able to pursue an adult use industry, which I believe that is where a lot of people will participate in. And lastly, I just also want to add and emphasize the importance of the development of local markets, because I think it's understandable that a lot of companies are gearing themselves to export. However, I'm not sure how sustainable that is. And looking at the trends on the African continent, population growth, the African Free Trade Agreement, I think there's potential to really benefit from the cannabis industry, but in the sense of promoting inter-African trade. And lastly, I also would like to highlight the importance of not just necessarily looking towards job creation, but also reform to create an enabling environment where people that have already been using cannabis as a cash crop to support their livelihoods should also be able to do that outside the bounds of being employed. That should also be an option as well. Thank you.
No, awesome, 100%. I mean, we've seen New York try to do this in terms of a more integrative approach for inclusion, in terms of previously disadvantaged members of society related to cannabis prosecutions. So, I mean, it's completely doable. On the point of the recreational, I mean, we saw an organization, FAAAT, release a publication called High Compliance, that specifically addresses how to, it's a very good read. I'm not all the way through it. It's, I think, 2 weeks out now, but it addresses working with the UN treaties on how to integrate a responsible adult use market. I love it. And on your point regarding low THC cannabis, hemp, fully, 1% is maybe an initial benchmark. I think a lot of countries have gone with. Czech Republic, Malawi's done it. We've seen Switzerland do it. We've seen Colombia define psychoactive as 1% as well. I mean, the list just keeps ticking over on the 1% list. And I think it's fully rationalized for the Department of Agriculture to really address the 1%, because at the end of the day, if you put it into materials for construction, if you put it into substitutes, what's the risk? You know, like really, the risk of diversion is ridiculous. And I mean, it also addresses the point you raised about testing. I mean, to test for a 0.2% limit, we agree that there is no proficiency testing established between labs. I mean, it's already too obstructive getting standards to laboratories. I mean, who's going to import a standard for testing and then consume that when it's so much more expensive than even medicinal cannabis? I mean, a reference standard is probably the most expensive form of a cannabinoid if it's a THC reference. I mean, no one's going to buy that for diversion. It's ridiculous. So SAPRA restricting permission for labs to test by itself is ludicrous. So for me, so many good points in all of this. I mean, there's so many ways we can go on this. But now we're going to throw it to Leslie, because Leslie, you've been active in the space. I mean, let's maybe kick it off as well in terms of you're an employer in the market, you're growing rapidly. Talk us through your current employment, you know, scaling, and how you see you as an organization going. And keep in mind for the audience that we're near 60 commercial licenses, not nearly all as successful as Felbridge, but it might give us some idea about the scope of the medical growth. And if that's fractional compared to industrial and recreational adult use, then it gives us some kind of barometer.
Yeah, so we're on 40 full-time employees at the moment. And I think as soon as we scale up to our full production potential, we'll be on about 120. You know, we also have a few segments of the business. One of the other segments is the distribution of genetics, where we import seed. We distribute that to local license holders, both hemp license holders and to medical cannabis license holders. And then we're also producing sterile tissue cultures. So we import the material, we propagate it at our facility, and we can distribute that to local and overseas license holders. So we see a lot of potential in all of these segments. But to give you an example, we sit in a position where we're importing seed, and we're a member of the National Seed Organization locally, and we can't produce the seed locally. I want to produce seed locally. Of course, we can make it so much more cheaper than bringing the seed in and creating more jobs there. But again, you know, it's a narcotic. You need a hemp permit to be able to produce the plants outdoors to make the seed, and it's not a registered crop, so I can't get the seed certified to be able to sell it internationally, because I can't get a phytosanitary certificate for it. It's just a whole host of little challenges that just add up, and you're kind of stuck at the end now, and we can't even start the process. So again, it's going to come back down to all the regulations, and we sit in a position where an example is Switzerland. You know, they've not only like taken the limit to 1%, but they've already mapped out where medical is going to be. So they're releasing their medical regulations, I think, on the 1st of August, and there's great apologies for being a month late or 2 months late, and it's going to be very, very clear exactly what's going to be happening. They've also started the dialogue in terms of recreational. So, you know, where are we? Like, we're sitting years behind unless we get the regulations out, get it published, get it approved, you know, get the bill passed. And then I'm like confident the jobs will come if the regulations are clear enough. If we know today that hemp can be grown at 1%, I think it makes us a lot more comfortable to invest further to enable you know, growing the hemp sector. So you know, I don't know if I answered the question, but I mean, you know, we're sitting where we're a little bit hamstrung in trying to grow our business because the regulations haven't quite caught up to where we are. So our focus has been very much exports, where I would rather be supplying that locally. I think, and then there's new segments in the value chain that start waking up all of a sudden. There's research, there's education, there's finance. You know, there's so many different aspects. And we must never forget, I mean, South Africa is one of the biggest exporters of cannabis globally. It's just black market. So, you know, what's going on here? You know, we were actually producing one of the biggest producers, yet we struggling to formalize it. And that just speaks again back to the regulations that are just not there yet. So
no, awesome. Struggling to formalize it. I think that's the takeaway message here. And I think I agree with you there. Switzerland apologizing for being a month or two late. We leave it to the very last, and then we still don't enact fully. And I agree with you. Switzerland's good at mapping it. I mean, they got the cantons involved. They piloted the adult use model. They based it on science. They're basing it on, you know, different partners putting inputs into the value chain. And I mean, on your points of IP for the crop, I mean, if this is going to be such a big industry, and if politicians keep spouting their proponents of the industry and keep addressing it in Sona, I mean, I hope they all watch this webinar, because I think they need to listen to the industry experts. And I mean, expert is a bit of a strong word, but I think we all have spent enough time, enough sleepless nights pushing for reform here, that we've wanted to see this growth. We've studied it, we've looked at it, we say, how can this happen, you know? And I think it's so important that I'm very concerned to see politicians pushing agendas for, you know, radical you know, I've seen it in Zimbabwe as well, pushing heavily for hemp, but where's it going to go? Like, how many people are going to stop growing one crop in favor of hemp, and then they're going to end up shirtless, literally, because they can't even make the shirts from hemp. So, I mean, this is the challenge, is politicians have a responsibility to who elects them to be informed when they make decisions. They really do. And I will be sending webinars to stakeholders, and I encourage anyone who does, once it's published, to do the same. But let's now address what has been mentioned by everyone as the regulatory stumbling block. Let's talk about legislation. Danmari, like, what needs to happen here? If we're going to enable jobs, let's go to you on the regulatory side, and then we're going to go to Sibs to give us some of that enthusiasm we know Sibs for, that constant voice of enthusiasm in the industry. But how do we get this to happen? So Danmari, take it off.
Sure. I think I can just start off by saying we desperately need a commitment by Parliament. And like Leslie has just highlighted, if the regulations are sound, the investors will follow, the jobs will come. But if we cannot get into that process, it really is just going to create this constant struggle. And what I mean by that is by creating regulations which are not sound, creating regulations which is not directed to a specific market, directed to create demand and feed demand, will essentially just discourage investment at the end of the day. But more than that, it will actually encourage disputes. And what we mean by that is, so for example, the regulations that was created with regards to complementary medicines was regarded yesterday by the Supreme, or the day before, by the Supreme Court of Appeal as not being valid. So if you have started creating a complementary medicine in line with the regulations, you've just found out this week it wasn't necessary, right? Yep. So because it's all going to change, it's been challenged and moving forward. So that is exactly what I'm referring to. We need to create regulations which are sound, even if they are attacked in a review process or in a court process. It needs to stand up for itself. It needs to stand on its own 2 feet and go, yes, it might not be a perfect scenario for one sector of the market, but in general, it is reasonable, it is logical, it feeds a market, it's there to speak to certain demands and keeping people safe. I need to point out that, you know, we're kind of in a bit of a catch-22 position when it comes to regulation as well. A lot of people are very opposed to regulation. We encourage safe products. At the end of the day, you do not want a product on the market which is grown on the minefields or anything like that. We do want certain levels of security for safety. That being said, also regulations and creates regulatory bodies, and regulatory bodies create jobs. So we also need to be mindful of these things, that these regulations in themselves also do create jobs by regulatory bodies. But if we can find a policy that is effective and efficient in its application, this can run. It really can. I believe that. I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic. 5 years, maybe a bit short, just because, as I've mentioned, these things come out, they're challenged. Even the private purposes bill, how long has that taken to get to a first draft? It was immediately attacked, and in my opinion, rightfully so, in various areas. And now we're back. We have to go back to public participation. They're in a second round of public participation now, and we're still not anywhere near an act, at least not that I'm aware of. So these sorts of things are really needs a commitment by government to give us sound regulations. I mean, as we've mentioned, the medicinal side's very expensive. It's highly, highly regulated. And even if you have a license, it doesn't even necessarily mean that you can create an end product. Your license conditions can limit you to say that you're only entitled to grow the bud and the bud itself. You can't process the bud into a joint. You can't process it into anything. It has to be the dry bud, dry packaged and shipped overseas. So even if you do make those investments, you need to have sound advice as well to make sure that what we have at the moment can support your business plan as well, because the industry is very limited, as we've explained. So in the medical side, very limited. You need to ensure all of your licenses are in place, your permits are in place. And, you know, if it's not, you do stand to lose your license, and you stand to lose whatever progress you've made so far. And the investment that you've made so far, as Sibs has pointed out, if you have a SAHPRA facility, it needs to be in place before the license is issued. And even after it's issued, if you step out of line, you can lose that investment. So it's very important for you to make these decisions and understand them. From the recreational side, we are excited to hear that they are considering a commercial side of that. But that being said, presently at the moment, the Constitutional Court judgment was the catalyst for all of this. It started it was wonderful, but it does very, very, very clearly state there, not for sale, for personal private purposes. And that in itself is fantastic. It does give people right to access cannabis, you know, in a legal manner, to grow it for themselves, whether it be for medicinal or recreational reasons. That being said, however, the moment that you are found to be exchanging this for some level of remuneration, you are putting yourself at risk. And this doesn't just include you doing cash for crop. You know, this includes you giving away cannabis in exchange for other services, or giving away cannabis in exchange for goodwill. So that's why people need to be extremely careful as well, and which is suffocating the industry at the end of the day. I mean, as we've mentioned, there is a lot of illicit substances or markets out there, you know, and I think the legal market is not necessarily going to solve that, as we've seen with other international markets. Instead, what we need to find is some way to create policy that will encourage that market naturally, so that it becomes, you know, a better decision, a more natural decision for you to go to the legal market versus the black market for commercialization. So, and then of course we have hemp. Ayanda has really taken everything so well and pointed all of the issues out so well there. It really is in its infancy at this point in time. Getting any response to your application has taken a while. Lots of people have submitted in October already and only started receiving responses at this point in time. Some have given up. So, you know, and that in itself is discouraging. If you as a farmer is interested in the commercial hemp market, and you're taking an interest, and it's taking so long just for you to understand the process and to get the permit, and then understanding afterwards maybe that it doesn't really give you much of a value chain unless you develop it yourself. So all of these things need to be in the back of your mind when you want to enter the industry. And it really is going to take a fundamental effort by government to find something sound, but more importantly, to put that into logical, sound, scientific discussions and outcomes, so that if it is attacked, it can stand up to itself in court and review applications, and the industry can keep running, instead of, you know, submitting really wafty regulations, which is going to be attacked, not going to inspire investors, not going to inspire the industry to move forward.
Awesome. I mean, this is such a good panel. I mean, I have to say, this is turning out to be one of my favorite conversations about like just the industry and the sector. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the complementary medicines ruling this week. I mean, that's a massive, it's good and bad depending on how you see it, but it's great to show, like, we've got to figure out the policy, because it can be overturned so quickly, and people could have sunk money into a project, an idea, a concept, the entire time doing it, because it's good to see these things finally see the court decision. And to that point, the Haze Club, I mean, can we get a ruling on private clubs? I mean, really, how long are we going to delay, postpone, try to figure out the regulatory framework in the background? Let's just get a ruling, because then we have some precedents here in terms of where we're going. Like, let's get a decision, because that would probably give us a lot of clarity on like what is a legal form around the privacy and how to utilize that. So, I mean, there's so many ways we can go in this discussion. I'm really keen to get to this, and I think if there's time, let's talk maybe about a responsible use model as a question. But Sibs, let's give it to you, because I'd like to hear your side in it. where you stand on this viewpoint. So far, this has just been such an amazing discussion, and I mean, this can keep going for all night, if it's my opinion. But I know we're going to get to a point where we're going to have to bring in some of the questions. So, Sibs, let's hear from you.
Sure. So, look, I think the 130,000 jobs is definitely going to be a very long-term project. It's not, to Ayanda's point, I don't think it's anywhere in the next 5 years, not even 10. My viewpoint is sort of more 15, 20. And I think the big challenge with hemp is that, unlike other, focal industries for the government, where South Africa tends to have exceptionally actually good policies, good plans, good, roadmaps on paper, but then fails in the execution, and that's where we see challenges. With hemp, we're already sort of having a lot of challenges in the formulation first step, in terms of laying the framework under which this industry can be built and scaled and so forth. And it is a complicated industry, so you can understand why governments can struggle to sort of be coherent in terms of how to roll out the industry, how to sort of think about different considerations and impact so many different stakeholders, and so forth. But for me, it does feel that we're sort of missing that ability to aggregate, global best practice, sort of a strong understanding of the local socioeconomic dynamic, and really sort of calibrate our approach to be practical, to meet for example, safety concerns around cannabis for consumers, for minors in terms of recreational, etc., but also to create a platform for entrepreneurial, sort of energy and talent to really give it a good shot in the space, to create an environment where investors can have a level of confidence of saying, look, this is, from what I'm seeing, this is actually a really encouraging, place, and I want to, put some capital behind this and so forth. So, I think that first step is critical, and I think a lot of the panelists have sort of touched on some of the key components of ensuring that we can get at least a framework that is practical and that works. But then from there, I think the need for sort of smart public-private engagement and partnerships, I think, will be quite critical, particularly because of the long history of traditional communities that have grown this plant, dependent on this plant, who have to be taken along this journey for it to be sustainable. I don't think it's an option for it to be purely, geared towards just a capitalist approach that doesn't have an inclusive component to it, which is challenging. It's not an easy puzzle to put together. But I think once we sort of begin to at least get the framework right, or in a place where there's that level of confidence, we sort of focus on a domestic industry which would actually attract foreign direct investments. We talk to investors in the US and Europe and the UK, even in Asia, who are sort of waiting for enough confidence to say, look, I want to come into South Africa once I know that, in 5 years' time, there's going to be, 500,000 patients that are using cannabis grown from local sources. And, there's promise around IP that can be developed in South Africa. You look at the incredible work that South Africa has done in HIV and AIDS research and, breakthroughs within that space. That same energy, those same resources put into mapping the uses of cannabis to combat various ailments and so forth can have breakthroughs that can actually be internationally relevant. And so, it's not an easy puzzle to put together, but as I said, I think firstly, just getting that roadmap in place that is practical, that is not too cumbersome for commercial activity. We've spoken about the removal of cannabis from the Drugs Act is an important step. I think creating the right environment for entrepreneurs to want to take risks in this industry, but not feel constrained on day one, and then for investors to want to back that, I think is sort of the confluence of elements that can really propel this industry forward.
No, awesome. I enjoy that. I mean, I'm going to encourage anyone in the participation side, on the viewers, please submit a question, include that there. I'm going to raise another question from my side, and this relates to the points of two things: access and inclusion, right? So the first thing, and I've been a big proponent of medical cannabis because it is my background, but the second point, and I know this, is let's get ourselves through Section 21 to a point where we're already probably at about almost 500 patients. At what point does it take us 2,000 patients or 3,000 patients for us to now go and say to lobbyists, like, why is it that individuals with access to capital, who may be in the historic advantage, has access to the plant that everyone should have access to legally, but the rest of us don't? So for me, I know what comes on the back of success in the medical aspect side is that we're going to lobby more successfully for responsible adult use. Now, when we talk about responsible adult use, I think a lot of the jobs in North America are stemming from this dispensary model, the bud tenders, the aspects around storefronts. You know, there is this, how do we introduce it successfully? And if we do introduce it, how do we make it inclusive? And I've got my own views. I mean, for me, I see it as, well, South Africa's done a good job in what area? Well, we've done a good job with ensuring there's quality for medicinal products. So what would it take to take that model, to have it that we now look at a more inclusive participation on retail licenses or dispensing licenses, that then, you know, whether this should be SAPRA, whether this should be completely removed into an independent authority for cannabis based on experts in the field that understand the dynamics, the need for consumer safety, the need for bringing social parties into it. Like, maybe that's the way. Maybe we've got all these 60 licenses that are just not going to be as competitive as they thought they were going to be. They can't be all successful as Felbridge. They're going to struggle against Colombian competition. They're going to struggle against all these markets. So how do we get them to be inclusive on the dispensing side? So we make dispensing more accessible. We put some restrictions on age, the rest in there. We know that we're getting quality inputs. We can then enable testing so that at least we can now look at how do we get sourcing from these sites to the public so they have access. And then how do we get inclusion? How do we get individuals to come as a co-op? Because South Africa is known for co-ops. How do we get government to enforce some retail taxation to subsidize testing, which is going to be needed to allow for inclusion, so that we can have co-ops come into a central aggregator for testing and say, here's our 10 kilograms. We put a minimum to it. We know that's the requirement for testing. If it passes, we get to go into the existing distribution chain, which allows access and inclusion. And if it doesn't pass, well, then it's not deemed fit for use, it's destroyed. And that's rules by everyone can play by, because we care about some safety. And then forming the barometer on where the testing levels are is maybe a point of discussion. But I think that's what needs to start happening for us to see more jobs, to see general access, for us to follow with trends. Because going through Section 21, for you to be a legal user of a cannabis formulation or flower is almost preposterous. So, like, while we have or people putting in actual questions, maybe can I get a quick view on, like, what is the best model for including or enabling adult use? You know, I mean, there are two extremes. There's the one of use what we've got and what we've done right, and maybe formalize it better for the public so that it's controlled. How controlled is a debate, but there should be safety. And then the other point is, do we completely scrap what we've done? Do we look at, you know, like a completely new model? What are the risks maybe with that? What are the benefits? So let's run around. I'm going to kind of run in the same string so everyone can prepare their thoughts. Ayanda, I know you've been active in this point as well. You know, so let's run around. I'm going to kind of run in the same string so everyone can prepare their thoughts. Ayanda, I know you've been active in this point as well. You know, so let's run around. I'm going to kind of run in the same string so everyone can. Sorry, I've got a relay here. I don't know if everyone else is hearing the relay as well. Okay, it seems to have disappeared. So yeah, your floor.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, look, this is something that's like top of mind for us. You know, I think there are definitely different kinds of ways of thinking about inclusion. I think the route around sort of the recreational is one of the many. But if we're speaking specifically around this, I'm quite a big, you know, personal fan of like private clubs, especially if you have like private clubs that could have some sort of localized sourcing that would integrate, for example, farmers that are in traditional growing areas, for example. I think you might be able to, for example, get inclusion that way. I think on the dispensary side, I mean, to be honest, I think I hear a lot around how large that market could potentially be. I'm not sure. It depends also on sort of the regulations, right? Because for example, even in like California, where like most of your sales are happening in the black market, like overwhelmingly, because the regulatory burden is so high. So I'm not sure if that's really around the thing that sort of enables it. I think where you might kind of see a little bit more kind of interesting areas of like enabling inclusion might actually be in distribution, for example, that is often sort of an area we don't really talk about. And actually most of the people who are involved in the chain or who are employed tend to be the guys who are actually taking the product and moving it from one place to another, not just like the folks who are growing sort of just at cultivation level. So I think there's an opportunity to be a little bit inclusive around the dispensary model, but I think it's not around picking one model or another. It's around how does that model itself like ensure that it entrenches like principles of inclusion in it and becomes very creative around how you make sure you can, do stuff like responsible, like sourcing and like procurement. There are different kinds of ways of thinking about it. Where the government actually ends up landing on this, I think is going to be an interesting one, because the question sort of in my mind still is, what do those distribution channels like look like for the like traditional medicines, right? Or like stock that comes from traditional growers? Is that going to be the same? Is it going to be the same kind of standard that you're applying across the board? I'm not sure. I think we have to sort of think about this also with a view of what might some of the unintended consequences be around sort of limiting one area or another. But just to say, I'm very much a big fan of the dispensary model, provided that we're not talking about dispensaries that are just sort of sitting in places like Cape Town and in Johannesburg and Sandton that are actually not even themselves accessible to like populations, right? So I think we also need to be kind of mindful around sort of how does that model work. And if you're sitting, for example, in Gauteng like I am, there's a big thing around sort of how does that get integrated into the township economy, right? Which is something that's really, really very relevant for us. So I don't have sort of a clear-cut answer around sort of where the big unlocks are. I have some hypotheses around the areas to be able to look at, and the kind of some of the models that we have, I think actually could be transformed in a way that can actually drive the sort of benefits that we want from like livelihoods or inclusion, etc.
Yeah, fully. I mean, it has to be tiered. You've got to look at the different socioeconomic impacts fully. Like, I don't think one model will ever work. It's one where we've got to look at multiple models, and the private models work so well to a large extent in Barcelona, Catalonian region. I mean, there's a lot of good stories out of the region, and it's good to compare that with maybe a more traditional US dispensary type of model. So good. I know I'm going to pass it around. So TD, let's have you pick it up. Let's see how many minutes we can go here, because Serbs and the rest of the team, I know there were some questions on RDP housing. I think we've spoken to that in terms of industrial hemp to some extent. Let's hear from the rest of the panelists. I know that, TD, you're quite involved in drug policy, so I'd like to hear your view on adult use.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So actually, there's a paper I've written with an old professor of mine at UCT, Professor Andrew Hutchison, that addresses this specific question within the South African context. So I hope to share that soon. And from that paper, just to briefly touch on what we looked at, we basically looked at borrowing from other existing models. We looked at Uruguay, we looked at Canada, but we've also looked at similar industries in the South African context, such as tobacco and alcohol, and how those are regulated and what can also be borrowed from those industries in terms of what are the responsibilities and duties at national level as well as provincial level, and really just trying to set up a framework that works for the South African context, because again, it has existed for many years and it is persistent. So you're better off trying to create a regulatory framework that adapts to the reality on the ground than trying to shift everyone from the current systems. So just to be brief, that is what we're working on. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. It's really pervasive. So to try and put in stamp your own kind of rules and systems on it. Agreed. I like it. Let's jump. Leslie, your view?
We would way rather be supplying the local market than the export market. And I just wish the regulations were there to facilitate that. I think I love what Ayanda was talking about The only issue I have is, we're held to, as a licensed medical producer, we're held to like a really high standard where when I'm producing 1 kilo or 1,000 kilos, I still need to get full testing on the product, which can cost us upwards of 30,000 Rand, just to produce a COA to show that this product is completely safe. And I think, when you're not doing that, then there is the potential for other problems. You get product safety issues start to come up. So when it comes to inclusivity, I'm of the opinion that, the value chain's got a lot of links in it, and cultivation is just one aspect of it. And strangely enough, it's the smallest aspect. Ayanda was 100% right. Distribution. I hate to use the analogy, but in the illicit game, the biggest guys were the guys that moved it, not the guys that grow it. So I think in the same way in South Africa, in a legal framework, in a completely compliant way, the inclusivity is going to be in getting it from the farm gate to the end user in a responsible, safe way. That's just my 2 cents. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, fully agreed. I mean, it goes to the whole narco model. It's not so much about plant touching, it's plant facing. And this is the reality. That is how economics works. I mean, look at Amazon. Look at the distribution hubs. I mean, this is where the market is, the value, the jobs, it's in those spaces. But it's all pinned by regulatory understanding. So, Danmari, let's take it from you.
I think I'm just going to touch briefly on what everybody has highlighted already. I mean, there is frameworks that we can refer to. I mean, if you look at the alcohol regulations alone, there's regulations for those who produce it, those who transport it, and those who distribute it. And I can't see why that can't work in our industry, for example. That being said, I mean, when alcohol licenses started, some firms actually just stopped with normal legal work and they just started specializing in alcohol licenses because they would just submit and get them through, right? And it really was just this concept of, as long as you meet certain regulated principles and you meet certain tick boxes, you can get your alcohol license, and provided you don't step out of line, you can keep that license and it won't be revoked. And there's regulatory bodies attached to that. So there is definitely frameworks that we can fall back onto to help guide us. But I also think it's like we've pointed out, inclusion is also, various things. It's previously disadvantaged groups. It's those who don't necessarily have the income to enter into the industry, all of these sorts of things. And I think what's also important to remember is that there is certain provisions made in the past. This is not a new problem, meaning that those farmers struggling to get finances to put out cash crops, what that crop is not a new issue. There is social development as well. There's programs for government that's already been established to assist. And I think it just needs to extend further and into these industries. And that comes straight back to our conversation of, once the sound regulation is in place, we can push for those industries to be included in social development, so we can give farmers to the previously disadvantaged, teach them to grow beautiful cannabis in South Africa and enter into the value chain. But that is all going to come down to, once again, that dedication that we need from government to make this push in our country, so that we can also, from a citizen side and from an investor side, then also reciprocate by accepting this market more fully. I mean, if you look at the conversations from Parliament and private parties, there is still that stigma attached. I think everybody who's worked in this industry can confirm that. If you look at how government put up the private purposes bill, it's very defensive. It's like, don't go near kids, don't do, store it in any different way, which is quite laughable, because I mean, we've never seen anybody complain about a bottle of wine and the kids Powerade together in the fridge, right? So at the end of the day, it really just comes down to us understanding where the issues of inclusion is, and we can address them with each sub-sector instead of just trying to address it as one issue alone.
Awesome, 100%. Well, with that, I have to say this has been an amazing panel. I mean, I'm looking forward to the next webinars, the next discussions. To everyone out there watching, who watches even after the event, just keep doing your research, keep looking into the industry. I mean, this is, I do believe African botanicals and the whole sector is going to be so fundamental to how we see the world in the next coming decades. There's this constant move to natural medicine. And I think this is, and coming from a single drug molecule clinical trial environment, I mean, yes, I understand the full value of, clinical trials, the need for proprietary rights on those research, but I look at also orphan drugs. I look at the fact that when it comes to medicinal cannabis, it's often excluded because it's so good and it helps with so many comorbidities that it just doesn't make for a good clinical subset. And I think that's really important. Look at real world data, look at real implementation, look at places like Portugal, Uruguay, look at their policies on drug policy. I mean, people are always going to move to regulate their own moods, emotions, and their health. And there's no government that's going to stop that. And I think the moment governments understand that and work with citizenry in terms of like enabling their rights, and I mean, everyone would rather just access it safely. So why can't we just make it simple? Like, get back to fundamentals. Find it, like you said, the wine and the Powerade in the fridge. It's manageable. Yes, we can compare harms. Yes, we can debate. But I think this discussion has been really insightful and of a high level. And Sirbs, I'm going to hand it back to you. If you saw, I see you've been straining there at the eyes. If there's some additional questions I might have missed in the last few minutes that you want to raise, do that. And please be sure to close out our event and thank everyone involved. And I just want to thank the panelists. It's been absolutely amazing. It's been such a high-level conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next discussions in this space. And to everyone else, I hope you enjoyed the webinar as much as I did.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jeff. I think you've done an incredible job in moderating today's panel discussion. I think, there's just so many, areas that need a lot more time in terms of delving into and sort of really thrashing out. But I think this has been such a comprehensive discussion from, very esteemed and well-positioned players in the industry. And so on that note, I think there are actually quite a few questions that have come in from across a number of platforms. But I think what I will request is that we will look to answer some of these offline. And we are actually going to be posting the details to our next webinar, and so I think we'll be able to sort of continue this discussion next month. I think the 18th of May is when we're looking to have our webinar around cultivation risk management and sort of thinking about a strategy there, which is an extremely difficult part of the cannabis industry to get right, as Leslie has mentioned here. But I think in the interest of time, we will sort of be looking to wrap up now. And so I think on my side, just to sort of conclude and tie everything together, thank you so much to the extraordinary panel, the attendees. There's been some great sort of engagement and some good questions. I saw Nick Heinemann gave a really good breakdown of his view on the job creation potential. And I think he touches on certain industries that a lot of people don't actually think about, for example, tourism. Greg Beadle has made actually a very good point about how come locally grown cannabis is harder to get to patients than imported cannabis, which is just one of the many, sort of bottlenecks and challenges that need to be addressed and sorted out with urgency within the local industry. And there's a whole lot more in terms of questions that we won't have the chance to get into today. But so what I'd just like to what I'd like to close with is a thank you to sort of our sponsors tonight, Aeroside, who's our platinum sponsors, but Schindlers, Separation, 7NRG, Zubalola, and of course our US partner, Global Go. I'd like to just end off by encouraging everyone to have a look at Friends of Hemp and some of the work that they're doing, and really sort of engage with the organization, because your contribution and your support can go a long way towards unlocking key changes that can ensure the long-term viability and scaling of this industry. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much to our panelists for your time and your insights and your wisdom. This has certainly been one of the most rich webinars that we've hosted, and we very much look forward to having everyone back again next month for the next webinar in our webinar series for 2022. Thank you.